All right, let's go ahead and get started, and welcome back. This is kind of where we stopped things on Tuesday, and I mentioned that there was sort of by necessity going to be a very brief, a very high-level review of the things that I believe you have learned in 2300. Now, I'm not going to try to bore you with this. I'm going to try to talk about the things that I think will be especially relevant for us now that we're in this class, as opposed to just making sure we recover the entire ground that you tread already in the previous course. But what I would prefer that we do, and bear with me a little bit, is that as I bring up one of these review slides, I'm going to just quickly ask for a show of hands, and be honest. Have you seen this topic before? Okay. And by the way, I don't want to ask, have you not seen this topic before, because I understand no one wants to raise their hand for that. And maybe we'll just do like a confident head nod instead of raising your hands. So this is the OSI network model, right? That is the sort of conceptual framework that we use to understand and kind of also standardize the basic functions of a networking system. And we have those 7 layers of our OSI model. That each layer has a specific role. Each layer has communications with the layer below it and the layer above it, and it's kind of the interface between those layers. Now we also have, of course, the TCP/IP model, or the TCP/IP implementation, which is kind of the more practical, in practice version of the OSI stack. And that's used in the real world, in real world networking, and it has only those 4 layers. And you could argue that the OSI model is useful as as an understanding tool, as an educational tool to kind of think about and conceptualize how we can break apart via abstraction the different layers of what's happening in the network. But in reality, there's not a dozen different competing implementations of the same. There are a couple. And so we can get pretty far really just by understanding TCP/IP. And then as we learn slightly different things, we can then focus on the small aspects that are different in different networking stacks here. We could go top down, or we can go bottom up. Either one's fine. At the bottom, very bottom, we have the physical layer, right? That's the physical connection between devices, like even including the level, like what are the cables or the switches, the actual transmission of the bits, like the 1s and 0, how do they get from point A to point B on your network? Just above that, you have sort of the data link layer. That is how you ensure some level of reliability in your transmission of bits across that physical network. Things like your MAC addresses, things like your error detection, potentially correction as well. When we think of Ethernet, 802.3, that's our data link and physical layer in our TCP/IP model. We then have the network, which is kind of an ambiguous term, but our network layer, that's the routing of data, how we get data between different devices on different networks. So you may just hear it referred to as the IP layer, and that's appropriate as well. Above that, you have the transport layer. That's when you're going to have multiple things attempting to communicate amongst each other, and how we guarantee that there's some reliability associated with that. So that's your TCP, that's your UDP. We have then the session layer, and then really these next 3 layers are all kind of wrapped together in the application layer in a practical implementation, managing multiple connections, managing multiple sessions between applications, keeping track of them. And then at the highest level, you have like the networking services that are directly kind of available to you as the user or the programmer, right? That's your HTTP, your FTP, your SMTP, the whole alphabet soup that we have there. So we have this OSI model, and we think of these 7 layers. Then we have this in practice, we have these 4 layers. They're roughly referring to the same thing. One is more of just a kind of teaching or educational or sort of model framework for what could be the case. And then in that middle table here in our TCP/IP model, we have the reality of what all modern systems are using to communicate with each other. So you really don't lose much generality when we're talking only about the TCP/IP model. And for the most part, I think that's appropriate way to do things here. And then we have the actual data units that are being transferred from one layer to the next, right? That protocol data unit, that's our unit of data that's specified in the protocol for a particular layer in your network model, like in your TCP/IP model. So at the top level, at your application layer, you have whatever the message is going to be, your HTTP GET or your HTTP POST type message with the payload associated with that. One layer below that in your TCP/IP, you have your segment, or in TCP, or it's called a datagram if it's UDP. That includes all the application layer data, plus now it gets encapsulated with this header information that helps us start to determine where does that data need to go. Your source and your destination ports, things like the sequence numbers and checksums to increase the reliability of the transition of that packet. Below that, you have the network layer. Those are the individual packet. And sometimes, in some sources, you'll hear people start to refer to these things somewhat interchangeably, and you may even hear me doing that. But we have our message or our payload at the top level, what our application needs to send to do something, to get a web page. Below that, we have the segment. Then below that, at the network layer, we have our packet. That includes everything above it, so all the data that was encoded as part of the application layer, all the things that then TCP adds on top of that to ensure more reliable transmission, and then the additional headers for things like source, destination IP, sometimes other routing related information goes into that packet as well. And then finally, once we get below that layer and we're looking at the data link and looking at the physical layer, then we're starting to talk about things like the MAC addresses, additional checksums, additional error code, or error checking and control information for the physical addressing. And then finally, at that lowest level, at the physical layer, we have how we're sending these bits or how we're sending these symbols across a wire. That is determining what is the actual electrical thing that is going on, right? What is bits across a wire or some optical connection or wirelessly being transmitted, via radio waves all throughout here. But I think what's important from our perspective now, as we can look at a simplified packet view and look at this kind of encapsulation, we have some data we want to send, we encapsulate it to be able to do reliable transmission. We then encapsulate that even further, and that's what those kind of dashed lines are attempting to illustrate here, to allow more things like error checking and then the actual physical encoding of those ones and zeros. I think what can tend to happen when you look at like kind of an introduction to networking sort of topic, and you'll look at all the breakdowns of the individual header fields, and here's how many bits are used for the source IP address and the destination IP address and the version and the header length and the payload length and all those things. That's all valid stuff to learn, but what I find is sometimes when we learn that textbook version of things, we tend to not quite recognize that it's a very real thing. Let me explain what I mean by that. That this is not just a conceptual way of thinking about how network data can be transferred from one system to the other. This is the real world reality. In this room right now, there are probably 45 Wi-Fi enabled devices. Maybe that's actually low, but there's a decent number of those devices. And despite the desire that those are mostly shut off while we have class going on, there's a lot of data being transferred right now as well. This is not just a theoretical thing. These ones and zeros are being transmitted in that exact format at kind of a constant rate around us at all times. And we have to be aware of that and recognize that to be able to figure out what is ultimately happening in our system, to be able to dig deep and figure out what kind of vulnerabilities or what kind of exploits make sense. So you already know these things, it sounds like. At least the show of hands was not whether you knew these things, but whether you had seen this before, which is fair. We'll get to know it even more because we have to be very precise with what exact network traffic are we interested in, what does that exact network traffic look like, can we isolate it, can we discover what is happening in the resulting system. And we have tools that help us do that. This is just a random screenshot from NetStat, which is one of many applications that allow you to kind of visualize or sort of diagnose all the different network connections that you have in a system. That can tell you things like how many active network connections you have, what are they all listening to, allow you to do things like troubleshooting, like why am I not getting a connection that I think I should be connecting here. We can just run it. On any system you can run it, it'll only detect for that particular system. I think there's no issue with me running this live on my own computer in class. I don't think there should be. We don't need the statistics, so we can just do NetStat. Give me all the active connections. And there they are. nothing looks too terrible right now. If I go back and want to reload the Canvas page, just to give an example there, that should then show up in my netstat results, and it appears to be so. It's not meant to be immediately actionable necessarily, and I think what you find in reality is I only have, 5 or 6 web browser tabs open, but you probably have so many background processes that while they may not look like a web application, are effectively a web application with a different kind of software shim on top of it. And so there actually should be a lot of those HTTP or HTTPS connections on your machine going at any given time, including things that I don't want, like Bing for Business is being connected to. I don't want that. There's a way to shut that off, but I haven't cared enough, or I don't have access on my own machine. But you can see that it's not just a conceptual framework, this understanding of data being sent across the wire here. On your computers, on your phones, on your devices right now, you have many of these things going on concurrently, and it's not just the textbook saying here is what a network connection can look like. This is the reality of the underlying systems that are driving everything that we do. And so it's another thing to remember. This seems somewhat familiar. You've seen well-known port numbers before. I kind of go back and forth as to the importance of memorizing these. You may want to have find an online chart and just print it out and have it handy, or have a website you can go to for it. Probably memorizing isn't a terrible idea for just these well-known port numbers, just as a small survival skill as you're kind of digging through the sandbox and figuring out what is actually happening on the systems that we are exploring. The truth is, while there could be a large number of potential ports, there's a relatively small number of quote-unquote well-known ports, which is to say there are agencies that sort of allow you to register and allow people historically to register that when we want HTTP traffic, it's going to be over port 80. That is not a requirement. You do not have to run an HTTP server over port 80. That is just the default that your applications would be using. So if you see traffic on port 80 in a system, it's a good starting point to assume it's HTTP. It's not a guarantee, because you can do anything in theory over ultimately any type of port, but for these well-known starting points, unless there's some other type of trickery or obfuscation happening in the system, it is a good assumption to start with, that if you see traffic over port 22, there's some SSH connection or some SSH server available on that system. And the truth is there's more than these that probably should go into your memory banks here, but not that many more. There's like maybe 20 or 30. That would be just good to have. Whether you memorize it or whether you just have a cheat sheet handy, either one is fine by me. But again, there's just not that many of those. And again, as I mentioned here, servers are not required to use those ports, but lots of applications assume. So if I open up a web browser and go to a URL and attempt to access a website, if I don't otherwise explicitly specify that I want to use a different port, it will be attempting a connection on that machine on port 80. And that is what NetSat was attempting to show here, although it was doing so because whatever mechanism I had open was specifying that it was just HTTP or HTTPS, but it was doing that via the port number. It just wasn't showing the port number here. Also, this system has an inbound connection on port 139, which perhaps before just now you weren't aware of what that would be, but that would be one of the SMB connections. So that's sharing of files, and some Iowa State or department software is on my system that's requiring that to be open, or potentially I've been hacked. How about the three-way handshake? Get another show of hands about the three-way handshake. Okay, thank you. Actually, I won't go into any of the real messy details here. The idea is that when we establish a TCP connection, there is a three-way handshake. We first are sending a SYN request, a synchronization request, and what is not being shown here is some of the slightly, maybe less interesting details of there's unique numbers that get incremented every time we do that, and we can read the value of those numbers to know that it's corresponding to the same connection. But we put a request first, and that's going to be a flag in our TCP, in our ones and zeros corresponding to that segment that's being sent. We're going to wait and receive a message that has both of those individual bits sent, set, both the SYN and the ACK bit, and basically then to acknowledge that we have actually received that one, we send one additional segment saying, yes, I acknowledge your acknowledgement. We have a so-called three-way handshake. Bob, can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, let's talk. Why that becomes interesting, and we can talk about Wireshark briefly as well here, is that is the expected way we make that connection. That you send a SYN, you wait for a SYN ACK, and you then send an ACK back. And again, I talk about all the traffic that's happening around us at all times here. That's what they are all doing. But it turns out, and this will be maybe lecture 3 when we actually look at in practice what this does. Well, let me ask you, does anyone know why we care about SYN and SYN ACK and ACK? Why do we even cover it?
You can verify that you have a solid connection before you start sending data, because otherwise you're just kind of screaming into the void and there might not be anyone listening.
Well, absolutely. So your answer is absolutely correct. We need some sort of handshake mechanism to do reliable communication. Whether it's a one-way, two-way, three-way, four-way handshake, different protocols, different approaches, fine. Agreed. To reliably transmit data, we need some handshake mechanism. Why do we, as ethical hackers, care about this? Your answer was correct, by the way, but why do we as ethical hackers care about this?
Exactly what we're talking about.
True. So for reliable communication, so it's good. You don't know everything yet. This is good, right? There one more guess, sure.
If you want to do a man-in-the-middle attack, you would replicate what you want to do.
There are mechanisms that allow us to essentially act as a man in the middle. That's a valid answer, and to either kind of intercept and repeat and modify messages. There are workarounds for that as well. That's a valid point. The other thing we will learn, so your answers are all totally valid, and so we're good here, is that if we choose to write a client, this is how you're supposed to write the software, to do that, then wait for that, then do that. If you choose to open your TCP/IP connection and intentionally break those rules, what we will learn in a couple of weeks, and it's good that we don't already know this now, is we can actually learn a decent amount about that resulting system by just acting relatively badly. By opening a SYN and sending a SYN again before we get a SYN ACK. Or opening a SYN and waiting for the SYN ACK, but then never sending that final ACK. Based on how well-known pieces of software and implementations of networking code act under those various scenarios, it just turns out in practice. This is the difference between the OSI model of how things should work and the messy practice of writing TCP/IP related software. It turns out that in practice, how various operating systems, how various network stack implementations work, you're going to get different kind of results by just sort of messing with the TCP flags as we're trying to initialize those connections. And in doing so, it almost seems like magic, but in doing so, we can make really strong guesses about, in fact, what type of software is running on that resulting machine. Perhaps in a perfect world, every TCP/IP implementation is exactly the same and it behaves exactly the same, and we couldn't learn anything about the resulting software. In practice, that's not the case, and we'll learn a little bit about that in about a couple weeks, and we'll have a lab about that as well. And again, not to belabor the point too much, this is an example of what piece of software? Okay, Wireshark. Did you do Wireshark last semester? Okay, great. We'll do it again. The idea with Wireshark is just another way to kind of illustrate that this is not just conceptual understanding of our data that is being transferred along a system. Wireshark isn't that great for really understanding application level traffic, although you can use it for that. There's other software you would want to use if you wanted to really kind of decode HTTP traffic traveling along a wire. But really for anything below that, it is still sort of best in class tool for truly understanding things like TCP/IP handshake. I can open it up here and we can kind of see what's happening in practice with Wireshark. But just to show that when I talk about there's a SYN, then there's a SYN ACK, and then there's an ACK back, I didn't mention the details of the individual sequence numbers, but in practice, that's exactly what's happening. That's the exact ones and zeros that are traveling along this wire or being transmitted wirelessly, and that is how these connections are being made. I will just briefly open up vSphere here, and you will very soon have access to something that looks relatively similar to this, but not identical to this, which will be the machines that you will be using with remote access, this sort of virtualized access for your labs. You won't need it for lab 1, so I may or may not deploy it already to you for lab 1, but certainly by lab 2 I will deploy all that stuff for you and you will have access to that. And you will have access, as you have before, to the remote console of those individual machines, including what the box that will be your primary Kali box to kind of play around with the rest of the systems in your own kind of individual personalized network here. That should also not feel terribly new. It's just more kind of the same type of infrastructure that you would have played with before. And we can certainly on this machine, which I appear to have opened up the TA's machine, that's fine. Open up Wireshark and see what's happening on the underlying network traffic. And as I kind of showed a little bit with NetStat, I think it oftentimes can be a little surprising to realize that as I choose to connect to this network device, this appears to be a system that is doing nothing at first glance, right? It's just sitting here. There shouldn't be any network traffic. But in practice, that's not what's happening, right? There is, in fact, a lot of things that are typically going on, even if we think it's an otherwise, I don't know, static kind of system that isn't attempting to do anything. It's probably a fool's game to attempt to look at any one individual packet here and really try to appreciate what's happening. But the thing you will eventually, I think even for lab number 2, when you start to dive into using Wireshark and some of these other tools for purposes of this course, the thing you'll really want to get more comfortable with, and I can't teach you every single flag and every single guide, but you will be able to learn it. Things like the filters to say, I only want to look at ping-related traffic. What systems are being pinged from this particular machine? And not much is the answer, but then I can choose to ping google.com. And with that filter in place, now you can much more kind of directly correlate the action as a user we just took with the resulting Wireshark stream. Because otherwise it's too much, right? It's this sort of fire hose of information you're attempting to log, and there's only so much you can do with it. But even from that, we can learn a decent amount. What have we learned just by looking at that ping and the results in Wireshark? What kind of things can we learn? First, we learned that it didn't work, but that's a different issue. What else can we learn? Sure. That's true. I am physically connected to something. When talking about this kind of Ice Age virtualized infrastructure, the reality always is a little bit more messy than what it would be in a real system that we're on. But yeah, we're connected to a router. Network packets are going somewhere. What else can we look at via this ping traffic here? What else can we learn about our system? A couple things. Or about the world. What have we learned by looking at that ping traffic? Just going to town, I should probably tell it to stop pinging google.com. Google can handle it. What do we know about www.google.com? Anything? We know the IP address we're attempting to access, right? So at some point, although I think because of the filter we're not showing it, at some point there was a name lookup, a DNS lookup that I'm looking for www.google.com, went to a DNS server. At some point there was an authoritative response saying, you want www.google.com? Here's the IP address it corresponds to. I also know my, at least kind of local IP address here as well. So I have my source and I have my destination, and the ping traffic is getting kind of annoying, so let's kill it. Ultimately though, and this is an ICMP packet, so it's a little bit different than the TCP/IP packets we were talking about, you can see the entire network stack through that type of Wireshark traffic and that capture. The hexadecimal dump may or may not be useful, but it does try to help you by kind of highlighting what the various fields in the protocol data units would be corresponding to. And then there's a more like human readable breakdown here where what does the IP packet look like when I'm doing a ping request on a server, and in terms of the ones and zeros, that's your answer. Maybe you all have that experience, but my takeaway from this, what I want you to remember, is when we talk about user connecting to user, user requesting a connection, user responding, etc., it's not just this kind of conceptual, oh, wouldn't it be nice if things worked this way in practice. This is literally how things work, and there's the ones and zeros corresponding to those formats for the protocols that are exactly or what are getting transferred. That's my main takeaway, other than we have how things are supposed to work. In an introduction to networking course, you basically learn over and over again in different contexts, here's how things are supposed to work. And it is how they work in practice. Now with the kind of pen testing mindset, we're not necessarily developing new approaches to break how things work, but understanding that when things break down, when we don't actually follow the agreed upon handshake, the result can be interesting. The result can actually allow us to learn more about the resulting system than if we just try to do things the appropriate way. Have we seen CIA before? Okay, that's less confident hands raised for that one, but I saw some nods. CIA is known as the kind of security triad or the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I'm going to try not to be too hung up on vocabulary and making sure you have everything memorized this semester. But the truth is, when talking about some of these very specific things, we have to use slightly precise vocabulary to make sure our points are getting across. So I will try to have you do so as well, hopefully without requiring that you have all of these things memorized. Confidentiality, that's addressing the secrecy and privacy of information, right? Imagine a locked diary. Only the person who has the key to the diary can actually be the one who open it and either reading or writing the contents of that diary. In practice, right, confidentiality is ensured through encryption and cryptographic techniques of the type that we still kind of hand wave our way around in this class, and then you take a follow-on class that really dives into more of the weeds about it. But things like encryption so that you're scrambling the data, so that I can transmit my ones and zeros, and I know what those are supposed to mean. The person on the other side, the machine on the other side, knows what they're supposed to mean. But hopefully, if we follow appropriate protocols and cryptographic techniques, somebody who's intercepting that traffic in the middle can't easily determine what those ones and zeros are supposed to mean. So that's confidentiality. Can I send something without somebody else finding out what I send? It's related, but it's a different goal, and it's part of the triad with integrity, right? That's the correctness of information. Like a sealed envelope, I'm sending it off through the mail. If the receiver receives it and sees that the seal had been broken, doesn't guarantee that the contents have been changed, but now they have to be aware of the likelihood or the possibility that contents have been changed. Integrity is also oftentimes maintained through cryptographic techniques, but there's also non-cryptographic techniques as well. What we typically do to ensure integrity is that when we send our ones and zeros, we apply some mathematical function to those ones and zeros and send that result as well. And the thought is, if I change any of that message, the resulting hash or checksum would have also had to have been changed. And so that provides some sort of guarantee that no one actually modified the ones and zeros that were in transit. We'll learn more about this in the context of authentication, in the context of wireless security, and we'll see how it can be done correctly in some very common ways historically it has been done incorrectly. And then the third is availability, sort of ensuring that your information, your general resources are accessible, just really to authorize users when they need them. If we had a diary, we have a letter, so think of availability like a library. If the library is never open, you may in fact have confidentiality, nobody's reading the books, you have integrity, nobody's modifying the books, but you don't have availability, no authorized, no expected users are able to actually access the books. In practice, availability can be a little bit more difficult to achieve than confidentiality or integrity. You can achieve availability by having redundant resources. I'm going to send 2 messages versus 1, and maybe one of those 2 messages are going to get through. Or having a backup system instead of just a single primary system to be able to send the data through. And then just the type of robust security measures we are interested in. The hope is to be able to provide availability even under the existence of an attack, but it's really not a solved problem, and really none of these 3 are ultimately a solved problem. There is some of that vocabulary that I would like you to learn. And if you already know this, you're in very good shape. But we refer to something as an asset, that's something of economic value, something owned by an individual organization that we would like to protect. A threat is some event or some occurrence that can affect the confidentiality, integrity, or availability, or an asset itself. There's then the risk, oftentimes measured as a probability, but it also can be a qualitative thing. That's the probability or likelihood of the realization of a threat, that we have some potential threat. What is the likelihood of it happening? I've already used the term quite a few times, but we have this concept of a vulnerability. A vulnerability, when you're vulnerable, you're weak, right? It's a weakness in the system. Sometimes it's due to the system design itself, that the system is inherently vulnerable. Oftentimes, in the kind of things we're interested in discussing, there's a vulnerability in the implementation, so some software or code or some lack of checking mechanism. That is a weakness. Vulnerabilities are what get exploited. The exploit is something that takes advantage of a particular vulnerability and would lead to a risk of a threat. And then we have our countermeasure. Those are the various physical, technical, or otherwise administrative controls with the goal of being minimizing risks. I was trying to think of a great way for you to be able to make sure you have all 6 of these terms memorized, and I kind of failed, but I thought, just think all turtles refuse very elegant cocktails, and you'll never forget all 6 of those words. That was meant to be a joke. It's fine. You don't have to laugh really loudly at any of my jokes, but you get bonus points for doing so. Thank you. We'll be talking about this quite a bit this semester. Of course, there is always a distinction between, sort of textbook theory and practice, and there is no requirement that one has to do step A, then step B, then step C, then step D. The real world, of course, is messier than that. But in general, we can break down the steps that attackers would take into a relatively fixed methodology, which includes both sort of pre-attack phases, what we can learn about a system, organization, and network before we get started, and then the actual attack phases. What kind of techniques can we use to look for vulnerabilities, to apply exploits, to threaten CIA of a resulting system? Since there's a relatively fixed methodology, one kind of path forward for this class is to effectively follow those methodology and learn about the steps on a step-by-step basis. And after this, when we're done with our introduction, we're done with all of our syllabus stuff, we'll get started on reconnaissance. Next week in lab, you'll be doing some reconnaissance as well. The ethical hacking process versus the quote-unquote hacking process, from a technical perspective, is exactly the same. And I talked about this a little bit on Tuesday. There aren't a set of ethical hacking tools and unethical hacking tools. Ethical vulnerabilities and unethical vulnerabilities. It's all the same systems, it's all the same software, it's all the same tools. Some are developed by people who aren't acting with good intentions, others are developed by those who are acting with good intentions, but they're equally usable basically by anyone who has the wherewithal to apply them. The main thing that distinguishes ethical hacking from quote-unquote hacking or unethical hacking is this legal concept, right? I don't even want to talk about ethics and morality, but this really legal concept of consent. You had initial, ideally written approval to determine what scope of your pen test that you were going to be undertaking. Otherwise, even if you have good intentions, if you don't have that approval, you're really just a hacker. And there's all sorts of scenarios. This is just one case study that I kind of liked. Anyone from Minnesota in the class here today? Just one. Well, just two. You've made the right choice coming here to further your cybersecurity education. This is a story from a few years ago now of the University of Minnesota getting banned from contributing to the Linux kernel. It was an academic group, a research group, and they were interested in exploring, I think I have the paper open here, and the title kind of says, on the feasibility of stealthily introducing vulnerabilities in open source software via what they called hypocrite commits. It's a nice sort of academic title to it. The idea was, we had posted a few messages on Discord. It's not quite related to supply chain security for software, but it's not too far apart from it either. The idea that we are also reliant on open source infrastructure to be able to power all the systems that we run. And for the most part, those systems are available for anyone to contribute to. If your contribution looks good, doesn't matter who you are and what your credentials are, and in some sense it's very wonderful, beautiful, and democratic that that's the case. but there's really nothing in place for most modern software stacks preventing a potentially malicious hacker from adding things that may look good, but in practice aren't really very good here. So that's what this paper was originally about. Could they show proof of concept that they could add junk to the Linux kernel, basically was the idea. Now, what's I think a little bit ironic about that is that if you actually read that paper, and you don't have to read the paper, but if you want to, you can read that paper, they actually failed. They weren't actually able to add junk to the Linux kernel via these hypocrite commits. So the result was kind of a negative. We tried, they caught us, they discovered that our commits weren't very good and they weren't able to actually do it. But a couple of the kernel maintainers weren't happy about that. And so they said it was just one researcher, a pair of researchers, but the entire university is now banned from contributing to the Linux kernel. Now, those of you who've done open source software contribution in the past, what does that really mean? You tell me, what does it mean in practice that the University of Minnesota was banned from contributing to the Linux kernel? Sure.
It sounds to me like if somebody's like associated with the university directly, they can't contribute like they're openly with the university, like students would be able to.
And just, I'm gonna, for recording, I'm just gonna repeat that people directly associated with the University of Minnesota are the ones being banned. I think in practice, ultimately what that truly meant, and this was one of those stories probably blown out of proportion, is somebody with a umn.edu email domain is what was banned. So if you use a different email domain, you were probably still able to contribute to the Linux kernel if your contributions were valid. The point, though, is these authors were not hackers in the traditional sense. They were not trying to cause actual harm. They were trying to do research. They were trying to explore. They did not have consent ahead of time. They probably would not have been granted consent, which I think would have been the issue with trying to do that research in the first place. And in research, getting consent of human subjects is also a very critical thing we have to consider as well. So they kind of failed from that perspective. But our intentions are not what matter when we do what we are doing here. Legal permission is what matters. You, as members of this class, have my legal permission to conduct the experiments we are doing this semester. We could have built a version of this class in which the vulnerabilities and the exploits were just sort of artificial, something we would have created just for the purposes of this class. It would have been fine, that version of this class would have also been fine. It would have just felt maybe 20% less authentic in that experience. We made, as a conscious design decision, a version of this class in which you were dealing with real-world modern vulnerabilities and real-world modern exploits in this class. Now, a little bit of a caveat there that the lifetime of modern vulnerabilities and exploits is sometimes measured in like hours or even days at most. So when we talk about actual real-world examples, it's not that cutting edge. There's a limit to what we would be capable of really providing for you in that case. But within reason, you're being provided real vulnerabilities, real exploits, and you're going through that process. We're doing so with the understanding that you're doing all of that in our virtualized environment and you're not taking that home with you. So why do people actually care about doing these kind of pen tests, these approved, agreed upon ethical hacking experiments in the first place? There's all sorts of reasons. Certainly, it's just good practice to periodically check the CIA capability of your own internal systems and networks. So just for the sake of improving your security, you routinely check. How do you know if you're doing a good job if no one is trying to break it? There's also various compliance of regulations for credit card handling or medical and other privacy-related data that do require, via those regulations, periodic pen testing to ensure that when you're target, you're not going to be able to leak all your credit card information to hackers anytime in the near future. One more thing I want to mention, this can be the last thing today, and the different terms that you will see, and I only want to make sure I mention it because it can get a little confusing as you do the reading. We refer to both black box testing, white box testing, and gray box testing. Black box is a term that's a term of art in quite a few different fields as well. With a black box, you don't know what's inside the box. It's black. You can't see inside it. You're trying to hack into a system with no initial knowledge about the resulting system. On the other flip of that is white box testing, where the hacker would have full knowledge of the resulting system. The attempt is to kind of simulate a knowledgeable internal threat. There's value in that as well, right? If someone knows a lot about your systems, hopefully you still have mechanisms in place to detect if some malicious activity is happening. And then there's kind of everything in between black and white with your gray box testing. Someone who has some level of access or has some partial knowledge about the resulting system and determine what they're capable of doing. What gets that confusing, and I want to make sure we're aware of these different terminology, that's black box versus white box versus gray box. There's also the terms black hat versus white hat versus gray hat, and they have nothing to do with each other. So they're just referring to different things. Black in this context means like, malicious is what's implying here, versus the white hacker, the more ethical hackers, those who are doing things for the right reasons. And you have the gray hat hackers, those who are technically breaking the law, but are probably not really trying to cause any damage. They're just curious, hey, look at this website, it looks insecure. Let me see what I can find out on this website. You're not trying to break the website, you're just curious about what's happening. Your risk here in this class is you take the techniques you learn and you become a gray hat hacker. Please don't do so. That's my only other advice. And then, of course, there's other colors. Red team, the pen testers, versus the blue team who are doing the vulnerability management and response. We can leave things here for today. For the most part, in your labs, what you'll be starting with really in lab 2, it's generally a black box approach to start with. We're going to try to enumerate the entire network and determine what is available. But then eventually we'll be learning more about the systems and can take more of a gray to white box approach. We'll leave things here for today. See everyone next Tuesday.